tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhaṃ dhammāṃ saṅghāṃ namasami. So that's March 5th, 2022. Time keeps passing. Winter retreat. Sometimes we might think, what are we doing here? Doing this, meditating and cooking in the kitchen and all the things we do here in the monastery. And what's it all for? What is it? What are we moving toward with all of this? And why do it? Why even come to the practice? So if we get kind of confused or we feel like we're maybe not sure why we're here, what we're doing here, it's always good to clarify what the practice is all about and why we do what we do. A death contemplation that brings us to this point where it's like, well, if we're all heading toward death, then what are we doing? We want to do something that's going to be beneficial. And then if we take on precepts and give up all sorts of pleasures and all sorts of the decadence of the world, and we give that up to come and live in the monastery, why would we do that? And so for most of us, we've sampled our fair share of sense pleasures, and we acknowledge that it hasn't given us any lasting benefit. Quite the contrary, it's left us with a sense of that it's all empty and quite meaningless, that we might get a brief burst of sensual pleasure, and then we're left bereft and empty and vacant afterwards, and then we don't really know to do anything else other than to seek more of it. And then after we've done enough of that, then we're like, well, there must be some other way. So then we end up in the monastery. There's a phrase in the suttas, who has a word or two to lessen this suffering? Who can I find who has a word or two to lessen this dukkha? So we find in the suttas, sense pleasures are without meaning, a dart, a tumor, all these words the Buddha uses for sense pleasures, and that's a universal insight, universal truth that the Buddha comes to. So that's why we end up seeking the Dhamma. That's why we end up trying to look for another way. And so we come to practice, and then we endure all sorts of suffering, and we go into the meditation, and we come up against ourselves, which can be a very difficult experience. It might be nice at first. Meditating might be nice at first. Keeping the precepts might be nice at first, and then we start to settle into life in the monastery, and it might seem very inspiring at first, and then we're faced with years of drudgery in terms of the work that it actually takes, that we have to put into the practice. So we might have the Buddha sort of draws us in with a couple nice meditation experiences, and then we have all this hard work to do ahead of us, the hard work of letting go, developing Sila Samadhi Panya, developing the wisdom of letting go, So we put in all this hard work, and then it might seem quite meaningless. Also, like, what am I doing here? Can I actually do it? Can I actually make progress along this path? And then we do the generosity. We try to harmonize with each other. We do the daily schedule, the morning puja, the evening puja, the chanting. We chant these suttas, the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, 3 cardinal suttas, Dhammacakkappavattana, Anatta-lakkhana, and the Aditta-pariyaya, the fire sermon. We chant those hundreds. We chant those even thousands of times the longer we're here. We do the morning and evening chanting. We learn the parittas, sit through these patimokkha recitations, and then maybe at some point it sort of dawns on us what we're actually doing here, and how good it actually is, and what it brings to the world, what it brings to ourselves, what it brings to the world. And it's quite... The Ajahn Mahabua, doing that Ajahn Mahabua reading yesterday, the marvel of the Dhamma, it really is quite marvelous. And I love those reflections. He's saying, well, wouldn't it be great if I could just take the Dhamma out and show it to you and say, look how amazing it is, look how marvelous it is. But unfortunately, Ajahn Mahabua is saying, I can't just take the Dhamma out and show it to you. It's up to every person to see for themselves. It's up to every wise person to see for themselves. So we can't just put it on display and say, look, come and look at this. And isn't it amazing? So I think that's a very important reflection. So that's where faith comes in. All we can do is hear about it, and then when we hear about it, when we hear about the Dhamma, we hear about Nibbana, and we hear about stories about the great Ajahns, the great Acharyas of the past, or the life story of the Buddha himself. And when we hear about these things, all we can do is really speculate about it. When we hear about Nibbana, what we can really do is, I wonder what that would be like. But we don't know. So then, for some people, then faith arises when we hear about something like Nibbana or the deathless Dhamma. Then faith arises, and we might reflect on it to ourselves, well, maybe this is actually possible, maybe I can actually do it. And so the Buddha was a human being, and the great practitioners over the millennia or the centuries were human beings, and they had human bodies just like ours, no different. Human minds that they had to work with, just like ours, no different. Perhaps only different in, we talk about the cultivation of parami over perhaps many lives, many past lives. Someone like Ajahn Dan, who seems like he was practically born enlightened. It's like we might think, well, if we compare ourselves to somebody like Ajahn Dan, then it's pretty hopeless for me. I'm not getting Asubha nimittas when I was in college, or sit down to meditate for the first time and go into fourth jhana. And so might as well not even try. But then we're told that, okay, well, they put in the work in past lives. They're reaping the benefits of the work they've already put in. So for ourselves, it's like, wherever we're at, that's where we start. If we don't do the work now, then we're never going to get to that point. So, but that takes faith. That takes this quality of sattha. It takes faith to actually be able to put forth that work with that idea that it's actually leading somewhere that's going to be of benefit. So for those of us who have sampled the sense pleasure realm, then this is where we're at. This is okay, well that didn't work. that doesn't work. That didn't work in the past, doesn't work in the present, never will work in the future. It never has worked, and it can't work. It can't work. It can't lead us to the Dhamma. It can't lead us to ultimate happiness. So then we start to cultivate sila, samadhi, panya. We come to the cultivation of the precepts and the meditation and the training of the mind. The Vinaya, the Buddhist religion, the Buddha named it himself, the Dhamma Vinaya. So it's not Buddhism. In the time of the Buddha, it was Dhamma Vinaya. Dhamma is the truth of the way things are. Vinaya is like a discipline. And so the Vinaya is what trains our body and speech, except only under one or two very unlikely circumstances. You can't actually break a Vinaya rule by just your mind. Although for most Vinaya rules of the transgressions, for the monks' 227 rules, there has to be certain intentions, and many of them, there has to be a mental part to it, but it's an infraction of body and speech, body or speech. And the Dhamma is then the training of the mind. That's what we call or we could think of these as the sila of body, speech, and mind. So sila being virtue, and Vinaya would be the sila of body and speech, and Dhamma would be the sila of the mind, or what we call the sangwara sila, or the sense restraint. So that's the sense restraint, is that not allowing things in that are going to stir up that engine of likes and dislikes in the heart. So the sangwara sila is the restraint, or I actually prefer the word composure. The composure of the eye, the composure of the ear, composure of the nose, composure of the tongue, composure of the body. And then as the sixth, it's the composure of the mind and the thoughts. And what do we mean by composure? Composure is when things come in. So if we open our eyes sometimes, we don't just go around with our eyes closed, or we don't just go around plugging our ears, plugging our sense bases all the time. That's not expected in the practice. So when things come in, that's impressions, sense impressions come in. Sense impressions come in, and then that's the aramana, what we call in Thai arom. That's the moods of liking and disliking then arise. This is just the basic feature of sense impressions and of the mind. Sense impressions come in, liking and disliking arise. And there's pleasant and painful feeling, vedana. That's the pleasant, painful, or neither painful nor pleasant feeling, also known as neutral feeling. And these feelings have their default reactions based on a mind that is enmeshed in the world, meaning the mind that is not enlightened. So default reaction to pleasant feeling is holding on, grabbing onto, wanting more of, attachment, or greed, we could say. Wanting. So when we experience something pleasant, we experience liking, what would be considered a pleasant sense impression via the eye, ear, nose, or whatever, considered a pleasant sense impression. There's a pleasant feeling, liking, wanting more of that. Unpleasant feeling, default reaction, aversion, wanting to get away. So there's these default reactions based on pleasant and unpleasant sense impressions. And it can even be the mind, pleasant or unpleasant thoughts, good or bad thoughts, what we would perceive as good or bad thoughts. There's wanting more good thoughts and wanting to push away the bad thoughts, so that even with the mind in meditation, when what we think of as good or bad thoughts, those aren't the defilement per se. So that's a very important and kind of a subtle point that's really crucial to understand, is that the good or the bad thoughts aren't the defilement. The defilement is the wanting the good thoughts and the pushing away of the bad thoughts. So the defilement is the attraction and the aversion. And then the thoughts are just what we call vipaka, or resultant of mental habits that we've had in the past, or actions that we've done in the past. And then we keep that engine of Kamma going by the way we react to them. So with sati or mindfulness, we say sati panya, because panya is that clear seeing, that clear knowing of how to react, in the way of non-suffering. So sati panya. Sati is the Buddha's teaching of how to react to all these things in a way that leads to the end of suffering. This is also what I like to think of as letting go. Letting go, when we hear the words letting go, it's kind of, for a long time I had a hard time understanding this, because, I'm calm, I'm letting go, I'm not making a problem out of things, but still there's suffering in the mind. So what is letting go? Letting go I think of letting go as skillful response. It's something that comes from the panya faculty. So when we learn how to skillfully respond, and skillful response is sati. So the sati is that it's more coming into equanimity, neither the attraction or the aversion, but it's the clear seeing. Or you could say it's the reminder. We remind ourselves. We establish sati, we establish mindfulness by reminding ourselves to be aware of these things. So to be aware of these things as they're arising, the sense impressions as they're arising, and then that's the practice. And when we do this establishing of mindfulness, that's like putting the brakes on things. So that idea of putting the brakes on is a very important image for mindfulness, for sati, because the mind will start to spin out at various times. And when the mind is spinning out, then when we actually stop ourselves and rein it back in, we say, okay, well, what's actually happening right now? The sati sampajanya is that stepping back from and not being caught in the aramana, the moods of the mind, not being a slave to the moods of the mind. So it's a stepping back from and saying, okay, that's what's happening. That's not pleasant. There's this. We can establish mindfulness of the body now. There's that feeling in the body. There's maybe a feeling of tension or anxiety, bodily anxiety. There's thoughts and plans which are generating a certain mood. And we can see those things with sati. And then if they're unwholesome, if things are unwholesome, then we'll see that they're causing stress, they're causing dukkha. So sati creates a special kind of kamma. The Buddha called it the kamma leading to the ending of kamma. And this is also known as the Noble Eightfold Path, also known as sila samadhi panya. So it comes back around to that. So the Buddha has the monks go alms round. We are classed as alms mendicants, and here at Abhayagiri we don't really go alms round. We don't enter the village every day, but we do an alms round of sorts. There's the buffet table, and you could say that we go alms round around the buffet table. But sometimes the monks leave the monastery and they go tudong. I think the most recent tudong was probably Ajahn Ñāṇiko and Ñāṇiko. They did a short tudong. So sometimes things become very regular, and sometimes we have to shake that up a bit. So the Buddha talked about the truth of anicca, or impermanence, inconstancy, uncertainty. Things are always changing. But then when we're in the monastery day in and day out, then say, okay, there's this particular schedule, and we're pretty sure we're going to get food today. And the next day, and we're in the monastery, we're pretty sure it's going to be good food as well, because the kitchen crew is very kindly making us good food every day, tasty food, and we're pretty sure that's going to happen. So then we develop these expectations, and we might get upset if something happens, like the salad dressing isn't put out, or we might suffer over these little things, or the rice doesn't get cooked. Somebody forgets to plug in the rice cooker. That was one I did when I was in Anagarika. So I ended up putting the rice out with water floating on top of it, just because I thought, well, it's better to put it on the table than not put it on the table, even though it was completely inedible and nobody could possibly take it. But everybody was very kind and didn't say anything. But then, so we have to shake it up by leaving the monastery and going on these tudongs and saying, okay, well, I don't know what I'm going to eat. I don't know where I'm going to sleep. I don't know if I'm going to have a roof over my head. I don't know if what's going to happen today. So we walk down the highway, and we find this is very good for mindfulness, because the anicca, the impermanence and uncertainty, when it's really apparent, then that is very helpful for mindfulness and very good for coming back into the present moment. You walk all day down Highway 101, and it's getting close to noontime, and then you don't know if you're going to get anything to eat, and you've been walking, so you're very hungry, and you get to a gas station. That's the only place to go alms around, and so you have no idea what's going to happen, and we can't just go around asking people for food. So standing at a gas station, what's going to happen? And it can be quite a good practice, because it's quite embarrassing, actually, to just we don't have any money, and we have to just stand there, and it's kind of, nobody knows what we're doing. Most people don't know what we're doing. So it's these brown-robed figures, you don't even know what religion they are, and standing at a gas station with bowls, and they don't realize that we're hoping that somebody's going to give us food, but trying not to look like we're hoping and look like we're pleading, not looking at people with pleading eyes, keeping our eyes downcast. And so it is a difficult practice. And then, and then suddenly somebody offers food or chooses to interact with us out of the kindness of their heart. And that was one of the days. It was Aaron Titapo and I, day four of our tudong. This was our sort of the first Amero tudong for myself, for both of us, and walking north and not knowing what was going to happen. So we got to this gas station, and it was getting close to the time when we wouldn't be able to eat. It was getting close to the meal cutoff, and we were standing at this gas station, and it turned out a guy, a college student who had stopped to get gas, was inspired to give offerings, and the offerings he had was a bunch of canned food in the back of his car. And he had just, gone shopping or something and had a bunch of canned food. So we're right before the meal cutoff, and we get offered just assorted canned food, beans, carrots, peaches, whatever, in cans. And so our bowls are full of canned food. And and we didn't really have a way to open these cans very easily. So we sat down by this gas station, maybe 15 or 20 minutes away from the cutoff point of not being able to eat. And I just pulled out a knife and we just started stabbing these cans, just trying to open them any way we could because we're just really hungry. And pouring just cans of just slop into our bowls. And, but it was nourishment. It was nourishment for that day. And there's no way we could have predicted that would have been what we ate that day. And it was actually the very next day that something similar happened, and we got offered apples and peanut butter. That was our meal the next day, and we made the discovery that apples and peanut butter are actually a really great meal. Just a whole bushel of apples and a big thing of peanut butter. And just like, it's so good. And vegan also. Really good for mindfulness. We also develop these qualities of gratitude. So many qualities to be developed. Gratitude, kindness, all these things help. Dana parami, generosity. And we create a world of goodness around us through the practice. That's another point that struck me in the Ajahn Mahabua reading, was that he was saying, Kamma is quite, it can be kind of scary because even things that we don't remember that we did, we still reap the results of them. So even if we did something, say we did something unwholesome in the past and we don't even remember that we did it, we'll still reap the results of that. But it also goes the other way. If we did something wholesome, even though we don't remember it, we still reap the results of it. And then he says, he's kind of cheeky, he says, well, and with the results of bad kamma, there's nothing we can do. There's nothing we can do. We have to take it like a good sport. We just have to deal with it. That comes up in the suttas too. It comes up in the suttas where that the Buddha talks about different ways to deal with painful and difficult situations when they arise. And one of them is like, if you can't really remedy the situation or get out of it, you reflect to yourself, well, nothing can be done. The kamma is quite strong. And so this is the way it is with kamma. When we practice mindfulness for a long time and we start to gain maybe a glimpse of some insight into kamma, into the law of kamma, that it actually is real, that our actions actually do have results, and that unwholesome actions have unwholesome results, result in suffering. Wholesome actions result in happiness, that we see that that's something that doesn't change, that is something we can be sure of. That's a fixed rule of the Dhamma, a fixed attribute of the Dhamma, or of reality, is that unwholesome actions of body, speech, and mind have suffering as the result. And for unwholesome actions of body, speech, and mind, it's impossible and it cannot be that they have happiness as their result. Happiness cannot result from an unwholesome action. And on the flip side, a wholesome action, skillful action, body, speech, and mind, results in happiness. And it's impossible, it cannot be that a wholesome action of body, speech, or mind results in suffering. That cannot be. So this is when we develop this conviction in kamma in that way, that there's this normality of kamma, or a fixed law of kamma, of fixed law of the Dhamma, then, and that becomes, we internalize that and that becomes a reality for us, then that mindfulness is going to be through the roof with our actions of body, speech, and mind. And we're going to be... the mind is the difficult one. Body and speech is pretty difficult too, but the mind is the root. And so the mind is going to take longer than that training of body and speech. But with the discipline, something like the renunciate precepts, or the 8 precepts, or the 227 precepts, the bhikkhus, we're trying to train our minds. And so with these strict precepts, it's going to be difficult, because there's going to be that the mind doesn't want to keep the precepts. But we start to internalize it, and so the mind will start to keep the precepts. The mind won't. After we've done this for long enough, the idea is that if we don't transgress our precepts of body and speech, the mind will eventually surrender, because it's just too much suffering. It's just too painful. It's just too painful for the mind to keep resisting for that long. So it's brilliant that it's brilliant, and it's also brilliantly difficult to keep these precepts for a long time, but we do it, and at first we do it out of faith, and we develop that conviction. And it's quite marvelous, actually, when we develop a conviction in that fixed law of Kamma, because at a certain point we'll start to reap the results of our wholesome actions, and it's going to start to build on itself. There's going to be quite a bit of happiness. Even if we don't have some sort of super meditation, because this isn't about peak experiences. Practice is not about peak experiences. So even if we don't have some sort of super meditation, there's going to be quite a bit of well-being. There's going to be quite a bit of happiness that gives us quite a bit of energy to work with, to keep practicing, and that builds on itself. And we meditate, and even if the mind is acting up, we have kind of a baseline of happiness to work with, and the mind is acting up, but we know that's just what the mind does, and so we don't have those reactions to it. We develop equanimity. Mind doesn't have the same power over us that it had in the past. We just say, oh, that's just the ripples in the mind, that's just the mind doing its thing. Never mind. Doesn't have to. The mind rippling doesn't have to affect our level of happiness. So we start to see the mind with more. There's more of a sense of stepping back. There's more of a sense of mindfulness with it. I think Shay even asked Longpo the other day. You might remember. He asked Longpo, "What do you do when you feel really happy? What if you feel really happy sometimes?" I didn't overhear how Longpo answered, but I don't know. How did you? We'll just keep just experience that or something. How did Longpo respond to that? Do you remember?
To savor it.
Savor it. Savor the happiness. Okay, that's good. So what do you do when there's a lot of happiness? And just savor it. You don't have to get rid of it. It's if it's from wholesome actions in the past, that's a very natural result, and that's just going to keep planting those wholesome seeds, and they'll bear good fruit. So if we start to experience happiness and well-being during the winter retreat, then yeah, we can just savor it, rather than asking ourselves, what do I do next? Okay, I feel content. I feel a sense of well-being. What do I do next? Well, we can let go of that. What we do next is we let go of the question, what do I do next? That's what you do next. what you do next is let go of the question, what do I do next? So there is no next. So we do have a bit more time in the winter retreat. We've got a little over 3 more weeks. That is a good chunk of time. Many people have a hard time making enough time for a 10-day retreat, and so we do have 3 more weeks, and we can relate to it if we've been unsettled or having a difficult time, we can actually start again. We still have time to plant those wholesome seeds and make it good. And 3 weeks is enough time to have it be very good. And from then on, then after the winter retreat, we'll be getting on with things. But time passes quickly and imperceptibly, so it is good to really make the best use of it that we possibly can. A lot of us have had time to be on retreat. I'll be starting my own 2-week solitary retreat in a few days, and a lot of us have had that very precious time. So to make the best use of it we possibly can. And I think that's good enough for this evening. We'll leave that there.